at their unbelief. Holy words, holy wisdom.
Good morning, everyone. It is so good to be back with y'all. So for those of you that don't know, I said I was on vacation last week. That was really not true. I took time off last week, but we didn't really do anything amazingly vacation-y or relaxing. We moved. And so if you see me or Bob today and we're moving slow and kind of just like, I think we've both hit the wall. And so we are feeling it this morning, but we are thrilled to be back. We missed y'all very, very much. So Jill, my love, my heart to you, thinking about you this morning. As we dig into a new topic for the month of July, this is one I'm really excited about for the next 3 weeks. We're going to be talking about history these next few weeks, and we're going to talk about it in kind of a different way. But oftentimes in the month of July, we're celebrating America's independence. We're talking about, kind of the history of our country. This year was a particularly significant birthday for our country, and I know Doyle talked about some of that last week as he preached the day after the 4th of July. He was so happy with me. But if you noticed, our sign this week pays a little bit of homage to one of my absolute favorite Broadway musicals, Hamilton. I don't know if I have any other Hamilton friends in here, but we watch this and listen to the soundtrack at our house regularly. But there's a line in this musical that says, "History has its eyes on you." And I keep thinking about that as I watch what's happening in our country, specifically as it relates to Christian nationalism. I keep thinking of that line that history has its eyes on us, has its eyes on the church, and how will we respond to what is becoming quickly in wider culture the accepted view of Christianity? Will there be enough of us that are willing to stand up and say, that is not an accurate representation of who Jesus was, what Jesus taught, or who we are called to be in this world? I feel so strongly that it is on us to really kind of redeem the church in this season of history, so that this season of history doesn't become our legacy. We know better and we can do better. I believe that in my core. And I think one of the ways that we start to do better is to remind ourselves of a more accurate and a more historic representation of who Jesus was. And I'll explain why that's kind of gotten twisted here in just a few minutes. But I want to start out with what I mean when I say historical Jesus. For some people, that term is kind of like, what is that? It's a term that has become very, very popular with Bible scholars who have really been trying over the last 40 or 50 years particularly, but this work has been going on since the early 1800s, where they have been trying to kind of decipher the various versions that are presented of Jesus in the gospel and in Paul's letters as he interprets Jesus versus who Jesus was and what evidence do we have of that. And so it's an interesting and it's a fascinating study as we look at this man who was a first century prophetic figure. He was a prophetic figure who had an active outreach and teaching presence in Galilee and around Jerusalem. And I think it's important that we focus on who he was and his context, because it helps us to not just focus on the views that have been developed or created since he left this earth. So one of the foremost scholars on the historic Jesus, one of my favorite biblical scholars, is a man named John Dominic Crossan. He is an Irish scholar who has called America home for a long time. This is the abbreviated version of his book on the historic Jesus. The full version that I read is about this much thicker. And it's very heavy and very weighty, but it's fantastic. And one of the things that he talks about is how understanding Jesus in the context of history means that we have to understand 3 different layers. Number one, we have to understand retention. And what he means by that is the recording of the essential teachings, core words, and deeds of Jesus by the eyewitnesses who were there. So he's talking about the gospel accounts. And then he says the second layer is the development of those teachings. When people began to apply those eyewitness accounts and those words and those deeds into new context, or the ministry of Paul, the ministry of the early church, where Paul begins to try to interpret these teachings to apply to different situations that he's seen and different situations that he's experiencing and the churches that he's planting are experiencing. And then finally, Crossan talks about this third layer, and that layer is what we call creation. And it is composing new sayings and new stories and larger complexities that change their context. I would argue that the two biggest ways we see that happening right now in our current world, the creation around Jesus and the narratives of Jesus, is Christian nationalism and evangelicalism, right? Anybody think of some of those Christian Jesus bumper sticker sayings that kind of just come to your mind when you think about things? Like I've said here before, there are sayings that people have parroted to me my entire faith-filled walk, to the point that it took me a long time to recognize they weren't actually in the Bible. They weren't things that Jesus said. For example, that no one will ever give you more than you can handle. God will never give you more than you can handle. Anybody ever heard that one? Anybody hate that one along with me? It's not in Scripture. It's nowhere there. Jesus didn't say it. Nobody else interpreted it that way. But we've created these narratives and we've attached them to the teachings of Jesus. And we do that in a way that adds this additional layer of complexity that we have to sift through to remember who Jesus was and what Jesus taught. Why does this matter? Why are we talking about this today? Christy, why are we even dealing with this situation around history? And it's because of this, because I think that when we dig into and we understand the historical picture of Jesus and his context, it keeps us accountable as followers of Jesus and as the church from remaking Jesus to fit our comfort zone and to fit our agenda, which happens a lot. I also think that understanding the historical Jesus, it should challenge us. It should shape our present day applications of his teachings. So I want to look at a few facets. This would be months long if we were going to look at all of the pieces of the historical evidence that we have around Jesus. But I just want to give you a few highlights to ponder today with me. I want to start with Jesus' own context growing up. Jesus grew up as a peasant. That's the best description that historical scholars use for him consistently. John Dominic Crossan says this. He says, peasants are not only poor, but they're often powerless. Jesus grew up on the fringes of society without a lot of economic resources, and he grew up amongst a people who felt very powerless to control their own economic situation, their own situation in terms of their relationship to the government, how they could worship, what they could do. And we see this very frequently throughout history. We know that first century Galilee was kind of this conflict, this tension between the classes, or the upper rich and powerful, and the masses, which were the peasants and the people that were oftentimes oppressed and given a lot of injustice to keep them in their place. Because even though the masses outnumbered the people in power and privilege, as long as they didn't feel like they didn't feel empowered, then they could keep this system in place. It's also important that we understand that Jesus was being raised in an agrarian society, right? Heavily agricultural, though he himself trained as a carpenter. Typically in this kind of a culture, you're either producing food or you're producing a service to those that are producing food. And so this is important for us. When we look at the scripture that Vera just read, and we see this glimpse in Nazareth of Jesus trying to preach in his own hometown, and the way that people treated him is kind of this attitude of, who do you think you are? Like, I just saw you. You were just helping to fix my fence. You were just helping to fix my house the other day. What gives you the authority and the right to say these things or to correct behavior or to speak these things into me? There was this element in Jesus' life that was hard to break out of the box that he was in his own hometown, because that's hard for most people who feel like they are oppressed, who feel like they don't have any power. It's hard to break out of those places and to see ourselves beyond the spaces that society has put us in. But I think it's critical that we understand that this was the context that Jesus was raised in. He had a great deal of experience with poverty, a great deal of experience with being oppressed, a great deal of experience listening to the frustration of his friends and his neighbors and his family members. So when we see Jesus talk about and preach about the poor, when we see him specifically doing things to outreach to the poor and to the isolated, it's not just coming out of this place of head, it's coming out of this heart place that says, I know this experience. I get this experience. He had empathy because it was what he was born and raised in. It's what he saw every day. And here's something else that's really important for us to understand. This background, oftentimes in first century, early centuries, when we look at more rural cultures, when we look at cultures that are oppressed and have a lower income, we often see a more egalitarian society. And what I mean by that is society is less defined by gender roles. It's not just you do this and you do that and we'll do this. It's more we all need to come together and work together so that we all have a chance to succeed and to survive. And Jesus takes that kind of egalitarian mindset into his ministry that says women can be in this space, women can help to support. It's all about us coming together and working together. So how does that impact us today? How do we take that knowledge of Jesus with this peasant upbringing, this peasant human experience, and how do we apply it to our following of him? I think, number one, it challenges us to have our own heart for the poor and the oppressed and those that suffer injustice regularly. It should make us some of the loudest and most active advocates for the equitable treatment of everyone, that everyone deserves a chance for success. In our current world, our current nation, our current state here in Washington, I think that means things like saying, it's important to me that people have an opportunity to have housing and shelter, that all people should have access to health care in some capacity, that people should have the access to education and the ability to have social supports that can help them succeed and thrive into who they were created to be. That should be the voice of the church, not a voice that is saying only for some, not for all. Because Jesus didn't say only for some. Jesus made space and worked for success for all people. Here's something else that we know about Jesus. Jesus was a rebel. Like, Jesus was, he pushed the boundaries of his day consistently. And when I say that, he went against the grain of what was popularly done or accepted or taught because he had an interest in loving well more so than being liked or popular. And I think we see that consistently throughout these firsthand accounts of his life. How did he do some of those things? One, he constantly violated first century purity rules to eat with people who were considered unclean, who were considered outcast. He consistently healed on the Sabbath and worked and walked and talked amongst people on the Sabbath. In a culture that he was living in that day and age, where women were not allowed to have access to education, Jesus welcomed women to be taught in his presence. In a culture where women were not considered to be clean if they were bleeding, he actively sought a woman out to touch and to heal and to provide comfort and to say, I see you, and nothing that you're experiencing disqualifies you from a better quality of life. In a culture where women were not allowed to testify in court. They were not considered a reliable witness. Jesus dispatched Mary Magdalene to go from the tomb to tell the disciples that he was there, that they had seen him. Consistently, once again, over and over, Jesus is pushing these boundaries. What do we do with that, church? What do we do with that, and how does that shape who we are? Here's one of the things that will always confound me about our modern day Christian view of Jesus. Currently, in our American Christian nationalism culture, Jesus is often used as the poster child for law and order, for following authority, for paying attention and following the rules and staying in line. That's part of being a good follower of Jesus. That I hear that argument all the time, and it always makes me laugh a little bit, because Jesus was the opposite of the poster child of law and order and authority. Jesus was constantly challenging out of a motivation to not just accept what was and follow, but to question, to challenge, and to encourage the system to do better and to be better. And I think that's part of what we inherit as followers of Jesus, is this call to challenge the systems around us, to challenge them, to focus on justice, to focus on peace, to focus on kindness, to focus on love, and to make sure that we are helping people connect with what is holy in the world and allow what is holy in them to fully have a chance to thrive and to succeed. Here's something else that we know about Jesus. Not only did he have this background of growing up very, very poor, we also know that he was an organizer. He was a neighbor. He was a prophet. Jesus went out into the people. He didn't sit and set up a tent and just wait for people to come to him. He went out. He made friends. He got to know people. He heard their stories. He saw their suffering. And this is, again, one of the places where I look at the church throughout the development of history. At some point, many faith communities stopped going out and getting to know our neighbors. And we stopped figuring out what the needs are and listening to the stories and devising ways to support people. And we set up big, beautiful buildings with stained glass and steeple. And we waited for people to come to us. And then we got frustrated when they didn't. And when we look at who Jesus was, that was just not how he operated. He went out and he set tables. He invited people to eat with him. He invited people to come and walk with him, to see the things that he was doing and to listen to the stories that he was talking about. Jesus was not afraid to name what was wrong, to talk about it, to also give solutions and try to work to make things differently. And I think it's also important that we recognize that historically, when we look at the ministry of Jesus, he wasn't just trying to do things for himself. He wasn't just trying to make a name for himself. He wasn't trying to be the first big, Jesus-related Christian influencer. He was really trying to empower other people, right? He had these 12 guys that were following him, but it wasn't just those 12. There were hundreds of people that followed the way of Jesus. And Jesus would consistently challenge them. You go. You invite people. You connect with people. And then when he knew he was going to be leaving them, he said, you go into the world. You talk about these things. You share with people. You build relationships and friendships and set tables and invite people. It wasn't trying to make a name for himself. It was trying to create a lifestyle, a culture that he wanted to continue past his time here. And I think it's critical for us to recognize that in a season and a time in history where that legacy is threatened from being known as people who go out and connect and meet needs and love people well versus going out and preaching hatred and division and separationist, we have a responsibility to redeem that narrative. We have a call to go, to meet, to love, and to care. We also know this about Jesus. We know historically that his boldness, his inclusivity, his love, his care for people, it cost him his life. We know that historical and biblical scholars all agree that Jesus was put to death by the Roman Empire in partnership with the religious leaders of the day, most often for this charge of sedition, right? Rebellion against Rome and blasphemy, challenging the religious leaders of the day. One of the biggest misnomers in American Christianity today, and it's been this way for quite some time, is this idea that when you become a Christian, when you follow Jesus, when you do these things, when you go to church, if you're a good person, that it becomes this if-then kind of equation magically. If I go to church, bad things won't happen to me. If I pray, I'm going to be okay. You have this version of Christianity that we call the prosperity gospel. If I donate to the televangelist who needs a new jet, I'm suddenly going to have all my needs taken care of. We have this if-then kind of bartering system that has somehow become associated with who Jesus is. But the reality is, when we look at the historic example of Jesus, loving people, challenging the system, comes at a cost. It comes at a cost. And for us, that cost may be some tension. It may be some conflict. It may be our reputation. It may be our popularity. It may be our comfort zone to have to stand up and challenge things a little bit. It may require some of our time. It may require some of our resources. But following Jesus costs something, because it's all about what do we have to give, not what we have to gain. And I think that's critical for us to remember and to reclaim, to change the historical narrative that we are leaving today. Oftentimes we forget as people that the legacy we want to leave was built intentionally, one day, one moment, one interaction at a time. You think about some of the amazing people that have been in your life and the legacy that they leave. Jill, I think of your dad. And the legacy that he left behind wasn't accidental, right? He was someone who poured into his family. He was someone who poured into his community, into this church, and he did so intentionally every single day. And that's what we have to do, is to say, this is not the legacy. The way that we are headed is not the legacy I want to leave this world for what being a Jesus follower is. And I'm willing to do something about it. I'm willing to help change that narrative. I'm willing to help offer an alternative way of seeing what it means to follow Jesus. I'm going to be super honest. Right now in our country, the majority of Christians that I hear speaking publicly treat Jesus like a mascot for the privileged and the powerful. And they trot out this version of Jesus to use to sanctify hatred and violence and oppression with twisted versions of Scripture that, one, are not often taken in context, and two, are not an accurate representation of who Jesus was, what Jesus did, or what we are called to do in the name of following Jesus. We are not called to villainize those who we have differing opinions on. We are not called to believe that if we say yes to a version of Christianity that somehow we automatically inherit the American dream. Those two things are not theologically tied together. But they've become tied together in our country. And we as followers of the historic Jesus, doing the work to dig down and sift through all of the versions of Jesus that have been created throughout history and exist in our culture right now, we have this ability to say, no, that representation is not accurate. And I want you to experience who Jesus really was and what he really challenged us to do and really challenged us to be. I want you to think with me for just a minute. I want you to imagine our world today. How different would the headlines have looked this last week if this was the version of Jesus that most Americans understood and were applying to their lives. There's a 50-something-year-old man in Texas who would have still been there to celebrate today with his family. There are countless people who are detained across this country right now without due process who would be there for birthdays and celebrations and picnics and events with their families. There would be much less violence. There would be much less division. There would be much less estrangement between family and friends. I believe with everything that is in me that who Jesus was has the power to bring us together, that it has the power to help us focus more on what unites us than what divides us, that there are so many issues that we face in the world today, that if we could come together around the calls to love, to care for people, to feed the hungry, to support those who are in need, we would find common ground. And so my hope and my prayer, not just for me, for you, for us as Inglewood, but for our community, for our wider Christian culture in this country and around the world, to be willing to change our minds and change our perspectives and to change the history that we're writing right now. I want to invite you to grab your hymnals. We're going to sing hymn number 465. We are called to follow Jesus.